So I expect by now some of you have watched a video from last Sunday that's been online last Sunday morning, which is a CCTV camera looking at the front of Liverpool Women's Hospital. And if you've seen the video, it looks like a fairly ordinary scene, and a taxi pulls up right in front of the front doors of the hospital. And it's there, stops for a few seconds, and then suddenly there's an explosion. And white smoke comes out of the taxi, it kind of fills the air, goes up into the air. And then after a few more seconds, the driver's door opens, and a man stumbles out. And there's a security guard nearby with a high-vis vest, and he goes up to the man who's just come out of the taxi, and he leads him away. And initially, when you see the video, it's confusing what's going on. But if you follow the story, that man was David Perry. And David Perry has been really hailed as a hero. I'm sure you've read the story in the papers because of what was going on leading up to that point. He had a passenger with him in the taxi, and the passenger had a homemade bomb that they were carrying. And some of the details haven't really been released yet. But the story that went around immediately afterwards was that he locked the doors of the taxi in order to stop the man getting out. You know, he put his life at risk in order to protect others. And it's right, isn't it, if that's what went on, that he's hailed as a hero? Because we know, don't we, that the essence of what it is to be a hero is this idea of sacrifice. You know, think of any of the hero films that you watch. That theme is there, isn't it, of sacrifice, of people risking their own lives for the sake of others. And what we're going to see this morning is actually right at the heart of human history, right at the centre of God's plans, is a story of sacrifice. We've been working through the book of Isaiah as a church, and we've seen all the way through these kind of two themes running side by side. We've seen just the horror of people's sin. And it started right at the beginning, didn't it, with Isaiah. When he was faced with a holy God, he realised just how sinful he was. We've seen it in the people's idolatry, that they worship other gods, in their rebellion. You know, last week in our growth groups, there was the language, wasn't there, of stubbornness, of having foreheads like bronze and necks like iron. You know, we've seen it in the judgment of exile. But alongside that, all the way through has been this promise of God's blessing, words of comfort and restoration and hope and glory. And the big kind of question in the background in Isaiah is how? You know, how's that all going to work out? How can a sinful people enjoy God's blessing? And this morning we've got to Isaiah 52 and 53, which I'm sure for many of us are some of the most precious chapters of the book. And here we get an answer to that question of how a sinful people can enjoy God's blessing. So let me read from Isaiah 52:13 through to Isaiah 53:12. If you've got a Bible with you, you can open that up. I think it will come up on the screen. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted, just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they've not heard, they will understand. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he'd done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering to sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. It's a wonderful passage, isn't it? And it's known as the servant song. You know, the Lord here is describing what his servant, or we might say his agent, his hero, is going to look like. You know, there's a sense of it's a kind of artist impression, a sketch of God's hero. And who's being described here? Well, sometimes in Isaiah, it can be hard, can't it, to work that out? Not here. You know, the New Testament makes it so clear that God's hero is Jesus. 3 out of the 4 Gospels quote directly from this chapter and apply it to the Lord Jesus. So there's a verse coming up from Luke chapter 22 where Jesus himself puts these words on his mouth. He says, "It is written," and Jesus is speaking here, "and he was numbered with the transgressors. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment." It's clear, isn't it? Jesus is saying, I'm the servant, I'm the hero that's being described. Again, in Acts chapter 8, we get this little account where there's an Ethiopian and he's been in Jerusalem and he's heading back in his chariot and he's reading a part of the Bible. And we're told that he's reading this section of the book of Isaiah. And Philip is sent by the Lord to him. And he asks Philip, he says, "Tell me please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" And Philip begins with this very passage of scripture, Isaiah 52 and 53, and tells him the good news about Jesus. So it's clear, isn't it, that God's hero is Jesus. So why do we get this description in Isaiah? You know, this is 700 years before Jesus comes. Well, it's so that we don't miss God's hero when he comes. It's so that we understand what is going on at the cross. You know, think about when you're driving down the motorway. You get all sorts of signs, don't you, at the side of the road. You know, before a junction, maybe even 2 or 3 miles out, you get a big sign and it tells you where this junction's going. You know, maybe this is the junction for Manchester or for Bradford. And you're given a lot of warning. And then as you get closer to the junction, you get more signs, don't you? You get the 3, 2, 1 sort of leading down. And it's like that's what God's doing in the scriptures. As we get closer to Jesus, we keep getting signposts to say, this is who he is. Don't miss him. He's coming. So 700 years before he comes, it's like we get that big motorway sign, you know, which tells us who Jesus is and what he's all about. And actually, we're going to see that Jesus isn't the hero we expect necessarily. He might not be the hero we want, but he's the hero that all of us need. Because we see very clearly, firstly here, that Jesus suffers. You know, the structure of this passage, it kind of has an outer shell, which focuses on the suffering, and then in the core, we understand why the servant suffers. You know, I don't know if you're into those sort of time travel movies. You know, think of Back to the Future or maybe Doctor Who. And, you know, whether it's the Back to the Future car or whether it's the TARDIS, you know, you kind of go in, don't you, to these machines and you put in a destination. Well, imagine that you put in Jerusalem 33 AD. You know, and then the kind of whiz and the bangs happen and the door opens and there you are. There you are, just outside the city wall. You know, what would you see? You're there in the middle of a raucous crowd. You can tell something's going down. Everybody's looking towards one of the city gates. And then you start to see people coming through. Groups of soldiers. Groups of Roman soldiers. And they're leading people along. And as you look, you can see even from there that they're not in a good shape. You know, there's one in particular, and he's all bent over. And even from that distance, you can see his back is a bloody mess. And it's lacerated and raw from the whipping. He's all bent in a funny way. There's blood all over his face, some sort of thorns on his head. And it's all dried all over him. He's been stripped naked. And as the procession draws closer. You notice that that particular person is getting a lot of attention. The crowd are mocking, jeering, laughing. People are spitting at him. And he's completely on his own. You know, people around you are telling you that he's a popular preacher, but you wouldn't believe it because no one's with him now. You know, actually, over the course of the last few days, everybody who was close to him has deserted him. They've abandoned him. He's completely on his own. No one's standing up for him. And if you'd been there just, a little bit before and you'd seen the trial, you would assume he's a criminal. The whole crowd was calling on his crucifixion. And not just the rogues, the religious establishment. They all wanted him dead. Surely this man has done terrible things. Yet as you look and you watch him walk, there's something unusual. There's a calm about him. He doesn't shout back to any of the jeers. He doesn't resist the Romans as they lead him. And the expression on his face is not one of anger or fear or desperation, but of pity and love and compassion. See, Jesus suffered. He suffered pain. If you'd kept watching, you would have seen him nailed him up on the cross and enduring the physical agony of crucifixion. But he suffered more than that. He suffered shame, complete outcast, labeled as a criminal, abandoned by his friends, rejected by his people after all that he'd done. And he suffered judgment. Just a few hours later, darkness would come over the land. A symbol of the Lord's judgment being poured out on this man on the cross. Now, if you were that time traveller and someone said, that's God's hero, you'd struggle to believe it, wouldn't you? That's not what we expect a hero to look like. Think of the heroes of our day in the Instagram world. It's all flashy cars, isn't it? And beautiful pictures and hanging out with important people and curating, with their PR team, their perfect life. Well, when we see Jesus, he's a very different kind of hero. And initially we might be confused by that. Again, I go back to that video last week in Liverpool. If you just watched that video without any understanding, you'd be confused about what was going on. You might initially think it was the man who escaped from the car who set the bomb off, that man in the high-vis jacket was coming to apprehend him. But actually, as you realise what's going on, you realise actually his heroism in that moment. And it's the same at the cross. What Isaiah is making clear is that yes, Jesus suffers, but he suffers for our wrongdoing. Let me read verses 4-6 again. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. See, Jesus actually was entirely innocent in that moment. So why didn't he cry out? Why didn't he protest? Well, because he was focused on saving others. He was bearing the pain and the shame and the judgment that we deserve. Isaiah speaks about us being like sheep going astray. I was actually writing this sermon on my grandparents' sheep farm. So you can't help but look out the window and think about that. And what's the imagery there is that sheep don't always obey the shepherd, do they? The shepherd is trying to lead them and sheep dart off in another direction. They go their own way. And usually that doesn't end very well. And we are like that, aren't we, as people? We know God's instruction. We know God's desires. But we go astray. We think we know better. We go off on our own way. And so often that doesn't end very well. All of us have parts of the journey we don't want to present, don't we? Times when we've gone off our own way. Maybe you're still unsure about that. Well, just imagine that you got an email from Google. I don't know if you're on Google, I get these emails that give me on Google Maps where I've been, in the last year, a kind of summary. And during these last couple of years, that's been particularly depressing because it's only had like 1, maybe 2 dots on it. But, it's clear, isn't it, that Google knows where I am. Well, imagine you get an email from Google and they say that we might not have realized it, but our phone has been watching us and recording. And actually, they're fed up with people presenting these wonderful images of themselves. And so they've curated all the bits of the story that we don't want people to see, that we don't share with people. All those text messages that we sent that we thought no one else would see. All the pictures that we didn't put on Instagram. Our web history and the bits that we've tried to delete. Actually, the cameras and microphone have been on when we didn't realize. And that's been recorded. And that's going to be part of the footage. And then they tell at the bottom of the email, tomorrow we're going to send that out to all your contacts. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Well, how would we feel? Or maybe if the tech team right now put the lights out and that started to roll on the screen. I imagine at first we'd protest, we'd feel angry, wouldn't we? But if you're anything like me, the next thing would be fear and shame. I'd want to hide. I wouldn't want to see anyone again. And what's that about? Because actually that's just before others, isn't it? And that's just the bits their phone can see. But actually, what about before the Lord, who's given us everything? And he sees the stuff a phone can't record, doesn't he? The thoughts, the heart, the motive. I think all of us recognize, actually, when we're honest enough to admit it, that deep inside we're not all we should be. There are things we shouldn't have done. And the big question is, what are we going to do about that? The Bible is really clear all the way through the story that the solution is sacrifice. Either we bear it ourselves or someone else does. And throughout the Old Testament, that was often a lamb that was sacrificed at the temple. The lamb paid. But of course, ultimately, a lamb can never stand in our place. And Isaiah is saying, there's a better lamb coming. And this is what Jesus does. At the cross, Jesus suffers what we deserve. At the cross, he takes our sin, our rebellion, our shame, and all its consequences on himself. Think again about what Jesus went through at the cross. That's what our sin deserves. That the shame and the pain and the judgment that he faced is what we should face. But Jesus goes through it and offers to bear it for us. Think of it like this. So think of, imagine there's a light above me. Imagine that light represents God and all his goodness and his life and his love. And this is us, this is me. And we're made to know God, to have a relationship with him, to enjoy him. But there's an obstacle in the way, isn't there? And this represents, all of our rebellion, all of our wrongdoing, all the ways we fall short, all the ways we go off on our own way and ignore God and think that we know better. And actually our sin gets in the way. It gets between us and God. And what Isaiah is saying in these verses, all of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has gone to his own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Jesus was completely innocent. Jesus enjoyed a perfect relationship with his Father. And yet Jesus takes all that muck, all the ways we fall short, all the judgment that deserves upon himself, so that we now can know God. And here it's described that we can enjoy peace and healing and justification because Jesus has borne that sin. So can you see how Jesus is the hero that all of us need? The question, though, is how we respond. And I've got 4 suggestions of what it means to respond to these verses. The first one is to let Jesus bear our sin. To let Jesus bear our sin. Pilgrim's Progress If you've read that book, it's a kind of allegory or a picture of the Christian life. And it describes Christian. And at the beginning of the story, he has this huge burden on his back. And it's all of his wrongdoing, all the ways he's fallen short, all of his sin. And it weighs him down. It's always there with him. It's heavy. And wherever he goes, he carries it around with him. All the regrets, all the shame, all the guilt. And I guess lots of us will resonate with that picture. Ivan and Marianne shared a bit of that in their story. Knowing the heaviness of trying to carry all that ourselves. And what's the world's answer? The world's answer is to kind of try and hide that, isn't it? And cover it up. To try and repackage ourselves. Do our own PR. Put on a new Instagram filter. Sort of cut and paste the bits that we share with people and try and keep all that hidden so that people don't see. But the problem is that doesn't work, does it? We can't keep it hidden. And we know it's there and it eats away at us. You see, the Bible's really clear. The choice is either we bear our sin or Jesus bears it for us. And there's a wonderful moment in Pilgrim's Progress where Christian comes to the cross. If we could have the next picture. And when Christian gets to the cross, that burden falls off. It's gone. He doesn't have to carry it anymore. And the point is, Jesus takes that for us. Jesus says, let me take that for you. And from that point on, Christian is free. It doesn't mean the rest of the journey is easy, but he's not carrying that anymore. And what we've just heard and seen this morning is a great picture of that, isn't it? Baptism is a picture of being, Romans 6 talks about us being baptized into his death. In getting baptized, Ivan and Marianne have identified with Jesus' death. They are saying symbolically, Jesus, your death is my death. I can't pay for that, but you have paid. And I receive that. I want you to bear my sin. So that's the first response, to let Jesus bear your sin. And if you've never done that, if you're still carrying the burden, I encourage you to do that today. There'll be a chance to respond in a moment. The second is to enjoy peace and healing and justification. In these verses, this is what Jesus has won for us through the cross. Now, I know that COVID is still around. We're not done. But imagine the day when actually it's completely gone. It's no longer there. And yet, people continue to wear masks and keep separate and isolate and social distance. Well, at that point, that would be foolish, wouldn't it? You'd be missing out on the life you could be enjoying. And I think sometimes it can be a bit like that spiritually. Jesus at the cross has won for us peace and healing and justification. But sometimes we walk around as if we've still got that burden on, in shame and guilt. And peace speaks about relationship. And it's not just that we're no longer enemies, God, we're friends with God because of Christ. And we enjoy his shalom, his blessing. I think sometimes we can kind of feel like, well, God might have forgiven me, but he doesn't really want to know me. And this happens, doesn't it, when maybe we're struggling with sin. And actually, because we see our sinfulness, we keep away from God. We're distant from God. We try and kind of improve ourselves to get back into God's presence. But Jesus has borne it all so that we can enjoy peace. Or healing speaks about restoration. Look at Jesus' ministry. What effect did he have in people's lives? They were restored, weren't they? In all sorts of different ways, in a very holistic way. Jesus is in the business where we've hidden in the darkness of allowing us to walk in the light. And so actually, Jesus hasn't borne our sin so that we continue in sin. No, he's done that now to lead us, to heal us, to lead us in restoration. And justification speaks of righteousness. Because Jesus has borne all that, we are right. We are innocent before God. He doesn't leave us a little bit to do ourselves. He takes all of it, all the shame, all the guilt, all the judgment, and he bears it so that we don't have to. Again, how often we feel those accusations, don't we? You're not good enough. If people knew what you'd done. But we have a defense, don't we? When those accusations could come, we can say, Jesus has taken that on my behalf. The third thing that comes out of this passage is to know you are loved. And I think, obviously, there's big differences, aren't there, between David Perry, that cabbie, and Jesus. Jesus did all this knowingly. He knew what was going to happen. He knew everything about us. And Jesus chose to do this. Here is Isaiah. The Lord is telling us his plan 700 years beforehand. This wasn't spur of the moment. Jesus, when he came, he knew exactly where things were heading. He knew where all that trial would go. And he walked it willingly, didn't he? And he knew everything. When he did that, he knew everything about us. Not just the bit we shove on the internet. He knew all the other stuff too. And he chose to walk to the cross. Again, sometimes I think we go around thinking if people really knew me, they wouldn't want to love me or be with me anymore. Well, Jesus associates with us in our worst stuff. He takes all that upon himself. He enters into that, bears it himself. So when we're asking that question, am I loved? Ultimately we won't find the answer in our circumstances. We won't ultimately even find it in those around us all the time. Look to the cross. If ever we wonder about the answer to that question, look to the cross. There we see God's self-giving love for us, the lengths of God's love for us. And we know, don't we, that love is what we're called to. That's explicit. For those of us who are husbands, we're called to model our love on Jesus. But it's true within the church family, isn't it? We're called to lay down our lives for others. And I certainly know how far short I fall of that. But the reality is, we'll only be able to love like that when we receive that love from Christ. So know that you are loved. And fourthly, worship God's hero. This passage is about him, isn't it? Not about us. I was really struck by that. It is about what he does on our behalf, but ultimately it's about him. This is God telling us what his hero is like. And isn't he so different to today's heroes? Today's heroes, it doesn't matter what political party you're part of, what celebrity you follow. Largely speaking, today's heroes grab glory, don't they? Whether they deserve it or not. And they flee shame. As soon as something's going bad, everyone steps away from it. And Jesus was exactly the opposite. He deserved all glory. And yet he chose to take on our shame. And he didn't have to do that. He wasn't compelled to. He chose to do that. And I've certainly felt, as I've been reading through this, he's so different to me. It's made me so thankful that I'm not the hero. Jesus is the hero. So just, some practical responses for us. Let Jesus bear our sin. Enjoy his peace, healing, and justification.